welcome. My name is John Goldlock, and I'm a PhD candidate in the program for writers here at UIC. I feel very fortunate today to have the privilege to introduce my professor, Cris Mazza, and to frame her remarkable intellectual and literary work. She has helped me to frame and reframe my own thinking and writing, and time again, I've witnessed her do the same for other students. Mazza has a gift for creating ingenious frames. This gift is evident in her first stories, like the contemporary American classic, Is It Sexual Harassment Yet?, and in her first novel, How to Leave a Country, where the protagonist has no memories of her own, but only the memories of her partner. It is also evident in her magnum opus, Yet to Come, a polyphonic novel that frames multiple subjectivities, drawing critical attention to the mediating relations between them, as well as to the limitations of each subjectivity. In other words, to the limitations that traverse individual and trans-individual frameworks, from psychological frames of mind and forms of technical enframement to the first, second, and third person forms of literary, aesthetic, and narrative framing. Mazza creates frames and pays careful attention to how other narratives and images are framed, so as to both discover and recollect what lies outside the frame. In Camera, A Life Partner, an essay from her latest work, It's No Puzzle, Mazza tells the story of a photograph that features members of the Mazza family, gathered in the backyard preparing for a cookout. But Mazza doesn't focus on the content of the image, rather she recounts a series of events that happen off camera, outside the frame. Quote, I saw Mom come through the sliding door with a tray holding everything we would need. Hot dogs, condiments, even the special salt and pepper shakers only used at barbecues because they were pigs with chef's hats who oinked when turned upside down and shaken. Mom's feet went wrong or tangled in something, and she went down. I think I remember Mom crying. I do remember the spattered trail of mustard and ketchup on the patio, as though I have it on Kodachrome. I also remember we did not have that barbecue. End quote. The photograph serves as an aide-memoir for the action that is not seen, but nevertheless leaves an indelible impression on the young artist in the family photo. The essay June, The Mother We Thought We Knew, begins with an epigraph from Barbara Billingsley, the actor who played June Cleaver on the hit TV show Leave It to Beaver, 1957 to 63. Quote, June Cleaver didn't keep her house in perfect order, the prop man did it, end quote. Note that Billingsley's quotation is situated outside the frame of Mazza's essay, as an epigraph, and draws attention to an extra-diegetic phenomenon outside the fictional universe of a show set in the fictional town of Mayfield. Mazza writes of her enchantment and virtual bonding with June Cleaver. When watching an episode from 1960 in which Beaver joins a club that excludes his friend, Larry Mondello, she sees something gazing back at her from beyond the television frame. In this episode, themes of belonging and non-belonging are introduced. June asks Ward to speak to Beaver about these exclusionary clubs, and he tells his son a parable about people who live in castles. Later, June asks Ward if he spoke to Beaver about clubs, and Ward responds, quote, no, castles. Ward then muses, I wonder, what do people who live in castles tell their children? End quote. Mazza comments that this is, quote, a strange line to write, unless the two actors ad-libbed. That's what I'd like to believe. Because June, or Barbara Billingsley, replied, probably stories about Levittown. Mazza exhaustively researches and recounts the systemic racism of real estate practices in Southern California of her youth and across the US. Set against fictional Mayfield, her own suburban neighborhood, and its exclusionary origins is thrown in stark relief. While looking, Mazza is attuned to the gaze that looks back. The method of the diverse and fascinating essays that make up It's No Puzzle is of framing, literally and figuratively, and of juxtaposing frameworks. A puzzle presupposes completeness, a coherent image, if only the interlocking pieces are put in the right place. But of course, Mazza suggests that it's no puzzle. The framed image not only has its limits, but also creates the false impression that there is nothing beyond its limits. But to discover the limit is to introduce the possibility of transcending it. Mazza's work frames and reframes contentious social problems, pernicious norms and ideals, the unreliability of first-person accounts, and the imminent self-undermining constitutive of so much everyday unhappiness. Her works examine relations to animal life with a keen sensitivity. Dogs hold a special place, but she often considers animal life more broadly. She frames and reframes the process and challenges of artistic creation, the challenges of pleasure and enjoyment, and, of course, the porousness of consciousness and the dissemination of ideas. Reading Mazza's work often leads the reader to reflect, to consider one's own opinions, biases, and, well, limits. What I admire most about Mazza is that she keeps producing new works, truly inventive, unique, brilliant, touching, funny, and sad works. In a review, the Wall Street Journal calls Mazza a subversive, anarchistic writer. Subversive? Yes. Anarchistic? I think the reviewer has the wrong adjective. It's hard to think of such an engaged teacher and writer as anarchistic. But Mazza has always been untimely, avant-garde, and à rebours. She's not an anarchist, but rather a singular artist. A legion of writers has expressed admiration for her work, from Grace Paley, Studs Terkel, to Rick Moody, Gina Frangello, and David Foster Wallace. In fact, a letter Foster Wallace wrote to Mazza is brilliantly recounted in It's No Puzzle. She recounts it rather than reproduces it, because although it is her property to keep and display, the DFW estate would not let her reproduce it, as she does with so many other missives in the volume. Mazza is one of the originators of the term chick lit before it meant urban girls looking for love. She is a novelist and memoirist of 20 titles. Her books include, most recently, Yet to Come, a story of marital angst in California's Imperial County, and Something Wrong with Her, a real-time memoir. Mazza's first novel, How to Leave a Country, won the Penn Nelson Algren Award for book-length fiction. Mazza grew up in Southern California and is the director of the Program for Writers at the University of Illinois Chicago. As a professor, workshop leader, and thesis director, Mazza is second to none. I'm currently finishing my thesis, and it is impossible for me not to be awed by her ability to continue producing as much as she does. And judging from her last 2 books, she appears to be doing some of her best work now. Please join me in welcoming UIC's own Cris Mazza.
I won't be able to leave this off because I need to see, but I'm glad John said so much about the Leave It to Beaver essay. I was going to read that and I had changed at the last minute. And so I made the right choice. Much of these essays have to do with, take place on, circle around a private school that where my parents met, and where they married, and where I was born, and where I have no memories of. And so I am writing memoir about times before I was born, places I have no memory of. And so I thought, okay, it's a different way to memoir. And I picked this for the cover because in this box that sent back the film reel of their wedding and honeymoon film, you can see that it was postmarked in Hollywood. The school's right here, Chadwick School, right here, was sat practically alone on the Palos Verdes Peninsula. It sat there with the Wayfarers Chapel, which is a completely glass church, which I will actually be reading about in what I'm reading today, and with a place called Marineland, which isn't there anymore. Other than that, it had a sprawling development far away from the school called the Palos Verdes Estates, and that is the housing development I researched that was so very outwardly and not hidden in the slightest racist in its advertising, but that was in the 20s. And so that was the milieu my parents met in, and I am going to read a piece that takes place at that school. But first, I'm going to read a very short piece from the title, not the title story, from a different essay, and I need to show you a page. So we'll go off of that. This here. Okay. So this essay is called Ask the Depot Commander. My father was commander of the Nuremberg Depot in 1945-46. When I said that at a different reading, I was told afterwards, I don't know if people know what was important about Nuremberg in 1945 and 1946. And I said, I think they do. So I hope that's true. At any rate, I asked him a little too late. He was probably around 97 when I started asking him questions about what he did then. And his answers were very brief and not really long stories. So I took what he was able to tell me and I broke it into parts that had to do with food or housing or fraternization or POWs. He was in charge of some prisoners of war as well. And I gave myself the problem of, on this side, I would write my dad's story, and on this side, the history of that particular area, and I could not go over the length. But of course, I cheated by making the spacing shorter on that. But they had to sit on the same page like that. So you won't be able to see it very well when I turn on the light. But that's why my head is going back and forth as I mean. I think I elected to read the history part first. Sustenance. The world did not have enough food. For 7 years, tens of millions of men had not been working in any food industry. Hundreds of thousands of European crop acres had been devastated or left fallow. Untold numbers of livestock, farm machinery, and farm logistics had been obliterated. Tens of thousands of German butcher shops, bakeries, groceries, market stalls, and booths, if they still existed, had barely anything to sell. All over Europe, but especially in Germany, there was little employment to obtain money to buy what little was offered or could be found on the black market. The world was still rationing. Now German citizens had their shares determined by the victors. Army occupation orders included: you will estimate requirements of supplies necessary to prevent starvation or widespread disease. Such estimates will be based upon a program whereby the Germans are made responsible for providing for themselves out of their own work and resources. You will take all practicable and economic and police measures to assure that German resources are fully utilized and consumption held to the minimum in order that imports may be strictly limited and that surpluses may be made available for the occupying forces and displaced persons, and for reparation. You will take appropriate measures to ensure that basic living standards of the German people are not higher than those existing in any one of the neighboring United Nations. Eisenhower's deputy, Lieutenant General Clay, explained, quote, the Germans should suffer from hunger and from cold, as I believe such suffering is necessary to make them realize the consequences of a war which they caused. However, this type of suffering should not extend to the point where it results in mass starvation. By November 1945, perhaps Clay felt the punitive suffering he prescribed had been accomplished, and he attempted to alleviate the situation by announcing an allocation of 1,500 calories a day in the American sector. Typically, this was 5½ slices of bread, 3 medium potatoes, 3 tablespoons of oatmeal, 1 tablespoon of fat, 1 tablespoon of sugar. He accomplished this with imports of food from the U.S., with distribution still regulated. By March of 1946, with imported supplies exhausted, Clay had to reduce daily calories to 1180, and to meet that level had to release corn products in German rations. Corn and corn flour had not previously been part of rations supplied to Germans. They did not consider it fit for human consumption and viewed its appearance in their provisions a new act of retribution. Despite U.S. Army-sponsored Christmas parties for children and soup kitchens using Army equipment and presumably Army food, U.S. military personnel were encouraged or ordered not to give food to German citizens. Notice to U.S. troops: American taxes pay for your food. It is forbidden to give, sell, or trade it to natives. This was a poster in mess halls. Sagas are plentiful of spoiled or stale food being rendered inedible via gasoline, burning, or dumping into sewers. And a more specific legend, pouring cocoa into gutter drains in front of hungry German children. In the Army, the depot commander had already learned to hate scrambled eggs, oatmeal, and white gravy poured over anything. The rest of his life, he never once ordered the American staple biscuits and gravy. The depot commander had a fishing license dated 10 December 1945, issued by the Office of Military Government. In addition to bag limits, the license stipulated hunters will not endanger the lives of civilians or troops at any time by careless shooting, and Hunters will not enter into conversational conversation with civilians on farms or in forests. It was during a conversational conversation of the German foreman at the cable factory beside the depot that the depot commander was invited to go fishing. My dad took a picture. The fishing trip either preceded or followed the 2 oranges the depot commander gave to the foreman for his wife and child. "Where did you get the oranges, Dad?" I asked the mess hall officer for them. Sometime later, perhaps while on the fishing trip, the foreman told the depot commander that his wife and child had eaten 1 orange section every day. The 2 oranges lasted more than a week. In the early 1960s, when the fruit trees in the commander's yard were still sticks, 7 peaches were brought home from the store each week. Each of the commander's family members got 1 peach, and when it was gone, had to wait until the following week for the next batch of 7. When his tangerine tree was young and just starting to fruit, the commander's children got 1, then later 2 tangerines in their Christmas stockings. So that is how I managed to get my father's stories told, and wrote a memoiristic essay in without first person. I do go into first person for the other essays. So when my sisters and I cleared out our parents' house in 2018, I was the one that saved all the archives, like you saw on my dad's mess card that said, "Save this card," and so he still had it. Not only all his photos from Nuremberg, but all his military orders, and then all the newspaper clippings that my mom had saved, and letters and cards and programs and just everything under the sun. I took them home and archived them, and I knew that there's stuff in there that I was going to be able to use. And then one of my sisters found a photograph that wasn't in a photo album, and she scanned it and sent it around and said, "Mom was bad." And it was a photograph of taken in 1950. My mom was the physical education teacher at that private school, Chadwick Academy. And so she was on the faculty basketball team, and one year in 1950 they played their faculty basketball game in blackface. So that particular photo launched 4 of the essays in the book, because I didn't have my mother to ask any questions about it, and it had a lot of, it led to a lot of questions because her life had not been, it would not have suggested that she would participate in something like that. And then this was the last essay that came out of that photo. It's called "What Would Jin Say?" You want me to get rid of this big light?
Remote
Nope,
control would do
it
that
doesn't.
well.
Okay. Since my sister found the photo of our mother participating in a black-face basketball team in 1950, I've traveled numerous narrative corkscrew spirals forward and back, crisscrossing my own lines of faulty logic, following and inventing leads left in yearbooks, newspapers, and lore, seeking to understand her place, and therefore my place, in whatever storm had that photo at its eye. There's one more launch pad in the blackface photo. The young woman who wore no shoe polish, no charcoal, no stage makeup, none of whatever the 6 others had used on their faces. Her name, written on the back of the photo, was Danny. In 1971, 20 years married and raising 5 kids, our parents took us on a 6-week cross-country tour in an over-the-cab camper pulling a pop-up tent trailer. In addition to rendezvous with relatives spread from South Carolina to Maine, one of the shortest visits was on Cape Cod. On the way to see Oyster Pond, where our mother had learned to swim, we stopped at an, appropriately, Cape Cod cottage in Sandwich to call on 2 old ladies. They were Jin and Danny. Jin's last name was Chadwick, the same as the private school that had given our father a free education in the late 1930s. That's all we were told. For a boarding school launched in 1935 that began hiring teachers in 1937, one that also boarded single faculty, having only 2 faculty romances leading to marriage by 1951 is a low frequency. I'll maintain our parents would have been the 3rd if the counting included Gin and Danny. Dad told us when he became a more gregarious old man that Mrs. Chadwick, the headmistress, had wanted him to be romantically involved with her niece, Gin, who had come to California from Massachusetts to teach in 1938. That was the year after the school moved from existing in a house on San Pedro to its own campus on the Palos Verdes Peninsula. Gin was a 23-year-old multi-subject junior high teacher when Dad was a 19-year-old senior, having missed a year due to depression. It's doubtful Mrs. Chadwick was suggesting a student-teacher affair, so it's more probable that her prompting Dad to date Gin came in 1949, when Dad returned to Chadwick as a science teacher following World War II. At that time, he was a 29-year-old eligible vet, and Gin, a 33-year-old never married woman. According to census statistics, the era was a time of swiftly declining numbers of unmarried women, so spinsters, a word still used, studied, and railed against today, were to be pitied or gossiped about. Dad said of Mrs. Chadwick's suggestion he wasn't interested. What would Gin have said? By 1949, another Virginia Daniels, had been teaching at Chadwick for 6 years. Danny was older than Dad by those same 6 years, but her marital status fluctuated. Although she was hired as Virginia Daniels and referred to as Miss Daniels in the yearbooks, she was married in 1942, the year before starting at Chadwick. Mere months after her marriage date, her husband shipped to England, so doubtless a hasty military marriage. After finding no archive of California divorce records before 1961, I traced Danny's marital status by tracing the remarriage of her husband. Through her marriage document and evidence of changing her last name on her Social Security record in 1942, I had the name of her husband, Donald Petrie. More marriage records gave me the date of his remarriage in 1947. So, by 1949, when Dad returned and was encouraged to date Gin, Danny was surely divorced. Would the headmistress have sought a young man for her niece if she had known about Gin and Danny in 1949? In 1978, Mrs. Chadwick came this close to acknowledging their relationship. This is a long quote from her unpublished memoir. Gin and Danny were pioneers who became old-timers. They left Chadwick for New England in 1970, leaving a great vacancy on our hill. On the Chadwick campus, the names Gin and Danny became linked as a most unusual pair of 2 highly individualistic personalities. Each one was esteemed for her particular gifts, and both were respected, admired, and loved. They shared a cottage on and off campus, and now on Cape Cod. Wherever they go, they create beauty, order, peace. They are truly a remarkable pair. The students and faculty of Chadwick obviously saw Gin and Danny as a pair. Maybe they didn't or wouldn't use the word couple. 30 years after Mrs. Chadwick's memoir, a blogger and part-time Chadwick archiver wrote a memory page for Gin after her 2008 death. In 6 paragraphs about Gin, this blogger did not mention Danny, did not even suggest Danny had existed. But she may have unintentionally alluded to Danny. Quote, Gin described herself as a stern New Englander. This meant strict, proper, stoic. She was very private about her deepest secrets. Combine the 1940s, 50s era's laws and prejudices with Gin's New Englander's sense of propriety and privacy, and this kind of careful euphemism makes some sense. That the students and faculty revered Gin and Danny seems earnest. The 1948 yearbook was dedicated to Gin. Was there ever a parent who pulled a kid out of Gin or Danny's class in homophobic intolerance? There's no way of knowing. What would have been the difficulties in Gin and Danny's lives? Teaching at a private school, not going to LGBTQ bars or clubs, being committed to each other, all would have kept their daily work and private domesticity peaceful. Were they even aware they should be fearful? In the 1930s, before Danny was in California, Prohibition made all nightclubs illegal, so gay clubs were just as underground as straight ones. In an unincorporated part of LA County, which is now Sunset Strip, out of the jurisdiction of the LA police, the gay culture was completely open and vibrant. I'm not going to put my hands up every time there's a quote, but there's a lot of them. However, the pansy craze came to a close once Prohibition ended and the Great Depression hit, and the 1940s and 1950s proved to be very hostile to the LGBTQ community. Until 1950, cross-dressing, aka gender inappropriate clothing, was illegal. In 1947, at the beginning of McCarthyism's Red Scare, there was a simultaneous Lavender Scare, which intended to purge the government of not only communists, but alcoholics, gays and lesbians, criminals, and deadbeats. All of these equated to disloyalty. In 1953, President Dwight D. Eisenhower signed an executive order banning the employment of homosexuals by the federal government. In 1951-52, California extended its, quote, ban on immoral conduct for teachers with a law requiring school districts to be notified when teachers were arrested for sex crimes and to decertify teachers convicted of sex crimes. While this sounds commendable, the language of the law was not just aimed at pedophiles. Forms of same-sex intimacy were, by law, until 1975, sex crimes. In 1978, California State Legislator John Briggs sponsored a ballot proposal which, had it not failed, would have prohibited openly gay and lesbian teachers from working in the state's public schools. By the 1970s, Jen and Danny were living on Cape Cod. Using a genealogy site and a newspaper archive subscription, my two chief sources of research about private deceased individuals, in the period 1970 to 92, I found virtually nothing about Danny other than where she lived on Cape Cod, a $10 donation made to Santa's helpers, her 1992 Social Security death notice, which listed no household members, and the cemetery location of her grave, which gave no further information nor a photo. For Jen, I found her official 2008 obituary in several newspapers, which, like the bloggers, did not mention Danny. As though programmed to preserve the privacy Jen prized, information about her on the genealogical site is limited to a timeline of the deaths of the rest of her immediate family and the location of her grave, a family plot. But from there, I found an ultimate embrace of their relationship in what is inscribed on that Boston Chadwick family monument. Frank G. Chadwick Sr., Elizabeth M. Chadwick, Ruth E. Chadwick, A. Virginia Chadwick, Virginia R. Daniels. Danny died 2 years before Ruth, an unmarried sister who also lived on Cape Cod, and 17 years before Jen. I can assume space was left on the stone for Ruth's and Jen's names to come after their mothers and before Danny's, and Ruth would have known this. 3 of Jen's other unmarried siblings died after 2000, and they also would have been aware of and agreed to Danny's inclusion in the family plot and stone. Like the Chadwick school family, Danny was likely received by Jen's family as part of the unusual pair. Perhaps as lifetime roommates, perhaps it was more frank than that, although it may have been only as forthright as Jen wanted it to be. In another Cape Cod, Mom snapped green beans on the long front porch of the Cape Cod ranch our parents bought in Southern California in 1963. Sometimes she read her mail there. That's where I remember her being when she told me about Danny's death. It seemed somehow important that she be snapping beans as she spoke. Danny died in February 1992, not a season even in California when Mom would be snapping beans. This conversation happened many months afterwards. Perhaps there was a handwritten letter on the table beside the colander of beans. Mom was slightly agitated. She didn't ordinarily share adult thoughts with me, although I was in my 30s. She was reflecting on her old friend Jen Chadwick, how Jin had nursed Danny through her years of affliction with cancer, including keeping Danny at home through the ghastly last weeks and days. I know there was a point to her thinking about it and needing to say it, even to me. I think, in Mom's soliloquy, there was something unfair about Jin's situation, and I wonder if it was that Jin was now living on half the income she had before. And of course, Danny's Social Security and/or pensions reverted to no one. In lamenting on how Jin had never wavered in her care, I do think Mom said, just like if they were married. But maybe that's wishful memory. Sometimes we remember things we want to remember, but this one is attached to other memories as verification. That is, in years to come, as Mom and Dad got older and, accordingly, more conservative, every time either of them would express a sentiment intolerant of gay lifestyle, I would think, but Jin and Danny were your lifelong good friends and you knew about them. That is to say, as much as I can claim I know anything, I know she knew. As is common in elderly Americans of their generation, Mom answered an urge to return to her religion, the Swedenborgian Church of North America. It's where this story goes next. From the church's website, this is a long quote. Swedenborg emphasizes the responsibility of all people to develop their own beliefs and live their lives accordingly. This, then, is the living reality of Swedenborg's teaching. In stressing freedom, diversity, and individualism, he issued a challenge to individuals, churches, and other organizations to be committed to the human growth processes and to express their personal commitment in ways as diverse as their numbers. Sensitivity to and respect for each individual's internal church or spirituality is what Swedenborgianism is really all about. The Mission Revival Church structure was one of San Diego's oldest functioning church buildings, built in 1905. San Diego's Swedenborgian Church had been holding services there between the neighborhoods of Hillcrest and University Heights since 1927. In the 1970s, Hillcrest became an LGBTQ haven. Couples purchased the original Craftsman and Mission Revival houses and began to rebuild the rundown community. Until 1960, in Palos Verdes, we attended the Swedenborgian Church's Wayfarers Chapel on the cliffs above the Pacific Ocean. After we moved to San Diego's city limits, Mom began bringing us to the Hillcrest Church. Dad, a Catholic, stayed home. When we relocated to the country, the trip to church would be a half hour, 45 minutes counting parking and walking, so our attendance at the Swedenborgian Church ended. Around 30 years later, retired, Mom resumed attendance at her church. She knew few of the members, even though the congregation was largely senior citizens. After she suffered a stroke in 1999, Dad began attending church with her. They often brought large bouquets of roses from their garden to adorn the small sanctuary. But the San Diego Swedenborgian Church congregation was shrinking, so they maintained information tables at local neighborhood street fairs to lure new members. The tenets of the denomination, begun by a Swedish scientist, its frank atmosphere of inclusiveness, aided by the appointment of a lesbian pastor, could be attractive to the surrounding progressive communities. Membership didn't swell, but there was the invigoration of some new blood. When California's Proposition 8, a law against marriage equality, was contentiously voted in, but then received its final unconstitutional judgment in 2010, it was a period when religious denominations were debating and determining whether or not they would allow or sanctify same-sex marriages presided over by their pastors and priests. So it was roughly between 2009 and 2012 when Dad's somewhat high and foggy voice was heard in the church foyer after Sunday service, declaring his hope that this church would not begin to perform same-sex marriages. Mom still struggled with processing language, especially in crowds, so she may not have understood. And neither one immediately perceived the tumult that began to stew. But while understanding conversation in a gathering could be impenetrable, Mom could read, and she had acquired a rudimentary ability at a computer to at least use email. She might call Dad over to read an email addressed to both of them, or she might have him read and correct her relearned use of language in her messages, but he adamantly would not use the computer on his own. So when the church's congregation began talking about what had been heard in the vestibule, and did their talking on the membership listserv, and when their talking rapidly turned into a determination that the person who'd spoken should be asked to leave the church, Mom was a comprehending member of the audience. I don't know if she told him what was going on, had him read parts of the listserv, or if he actually got a telephone call from the pastor. Mom used the excuse that she couldn't understand enough to enjoy the service, and they stopped attending. I know this happened because Mom told me. I remember we were in her computer room, the room that had been a bedroom for me and my two sisters. I was in her computer chair and she was in the extra chair where a second person could view the computer. But I think both of us were pushed away from the screen and looking at the bird feeder out the window. These details are important because they solidify my memory of learning what happened at the church. I am not able to fill in how either of them felt, except by inference from how and that she told the story. Telling an involved narrative was hardly easy for her. This one mattered, but in conflicting ways. Loss of her ability to understand a church service, loss of feeling comfortable continuing to attend anyway, loyalty to her husband. But I'm not sure if the issue itself caused consternation. And, too typically for me, I didn't ask Dad about the debacle. Maybe he didn't care. Maybe he was relieved. But something kinks my glands in grief, makes me want to shield him from what might have been a stab of disgrace, of rejection, of having it done in the cowardly public forum of an email listserv. He'd been so often a silent, stern, even scary father. And now, when he had become vivacious with friends or even a group of newer faces, he was met with public castigation for, perhaps age-related, lack of inhibition. His position to reject marriage rights for others is indefensible. If he'd said it at home at our dinner table where he sat at the head, would I, or any of us, have had the valor to remind him of his old friends Jen and Danny, one caring for the other to the end? Why should he get a pass just because he'd become a glib old man who had an enormous boomerang smile too big for his weazened 5-foot body? Eventually, it wasn't his own humiliation that would have mattered most to him because there was a subsequent loss. When Mom's congestive heart failure put her into at-home hospice for over a year, when that same computer room reverted back into a bedroom, this time with a hospital bed with a 24-hour caregiver, Dad had become the one attending his spouse's slow passing. And when Dad tried repeatedly to get a retired pastor from the Swedenborg Church to come to her bedside, he was, in effect, rebuffed. In 2015, when the Supreme Court ruled to enforce marriage rights beyond the man-woman delineation, Mom was no longer conscious or cognizant enough to know more than who was sitting at her bedside. Surely Dad noticed the opening of the United States to marriage equality, but this time he didn't say anything. And again, I didn't ask. There'd be no point in that. But all of us, each in our own way, thanked him for always kissing Mom goodnight and good morning, for bringing her flowers from his garden every day, for paying the $3,000 a week for the 24-hour care without flinching, for sitting beside the hospital bed holding her hand as he watched baseball, even as she might sleep 50 minutes of every hour. Receiving my thanks, he looked up from his recliner, his eyes hugely magnified behind his glasses, and said, "She's my mate." What would Jen have said? Thank you.